Waitress saw everyone, ignored the vampire, king's mute son, until she spoke to him in sign language. They told us that silence was the language of the prey, that to be quiet was to be invisible, Isolde whispered, her fingers trembling as she polished the silver goblet. But looking at him, standing amidst the wolves in velvet, I realized they were wrong. The firelight caught the unshed tears in her eyes, turning them into diamonds. Silence isn't empty, my love. It is merely a vessel waiting to be filled with the truth. And his truth was the only thing loud enough to break my heart. The scent of Valerius was always the same. Cold iron, crushed winter lilies, and the underlying metallic tang of blood masked by expensive perfume. Inside the grand hall of the Obsidian Palace, the air was stiflingly hot, heated by 1,000 beeswax candles that wept onto the black marble floors. Isolde Everhart adjusted the starch of her collar, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. In the hierarchy of the night, she was less than a ghost. She was a waitress, a human servant allowed to exist solely because the aristocracy needed hands to pour their wine and clear their plates. "Steady, girl," the head steward hissed as he passed her, shoving a heavy tray of venison into her arms. "The king is in a foul mood. Do not draw attention." Isolde nodded, the weight of the silver platter straining her wrists. She moved into the main hall, a cavernous space where the elite of vampire society had gathered. They were beautiful and terrifying, creatures of marble skin and predatory grace. At the head table sat King Leopold Blackwell. He was a monolith of a man, his presence so commanding that the air seemed to thin around him. He did not eat, he merely watched, his eyes like chips of flint, assessing threats in a room full of sycophants. To his right sat Benedict Thornwall, his advisor, a man with a smile like a razor blade. To his left was Lady Seraphina Greymont, who laughed too loudly and glittered with jewels that cost more than Isolde's entire village. And then there was the empty chair, or rather, the chair that felt empty, even though someone occupied it. Cedric Ashbourne, the Crown Prince, the mute son. He sat at the far end of the royal table, isolated by a deliberate gap in the seating arrangement. He was younger than his father, with features that could have been carved by Michelangelo, but they were marred by a perpetual expression of melancholic detachment. His dark hair fell over his eyes, shielding him from the court that openly mocked him. Isolde moved silently, refilling goblets with the thick, crimson vintage the vampires favored. She reached the end of the table. "He doesn't need wine, you foolish girl." Seraphina's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a whip. She leaned over, tapping a manicured nail on the table. He wouldn't know how to ask for it if he did. The boy is simple, a broken vessel. The court tittered. It was a cruel, sophisticated sound. Isolde froze. She looked at Cedric. He hadn't reacted to the insult. His hands, pale and long-fingered, were resting perfectly still on the linen tablecloth. But Isolde saw it. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his gaze fixed intensely on the condensation dripping from a water pitcher. He wasn't simple. He was thirsty, and he was surrounded by people who refused to see him as anything other than a mistake. "Leave him be," Benedict sneered, waving a hand dismissively. "The king has tolerance for his presence, but let us not pretend he participates." Leopold said nothing. He didn't defend his son. He simply took a sip of his drink, his gaze distant, as if the shame of his son's silence was a bore he had long ago accepted. Isolde felt a flare of heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the candles. It was anger. Pure, reckless anger. She remembered her grandmother, Genevieve, a woman who had served in the old courts before the wars. Genevieve had taught Isolde many things to keep her safe, but she had also taught her the old sign, the silent hand speech used by scouts and spies in the human resistance, a language of dexterity and grace. Isolde gripped the pitcher. The danger was palpable. One wrong move, one act of insolence, and she wouldn't just be fired, she would be drained. But as she looked at Cedric, at the profound loneliness radiating off him like a chill, she knew she couldn't just walk away. The banquet wore on, a parade of excess. Musicians played a mournful waltz in the gallery above, but the noise of the dining hall was deafening. Politics, gossip, and cruelty were the courses of the evening. Isolde found herself looping back to the head table. Cedric had not moved. His plate was untouched. The other servers skirted around him as if he were a statue, refilling Leopold's glass, pouring for Benedict, fawning over Serafina. Isolde stepped into the void of space around the prince. She placed the water pitcher down, the clink of crystal on silver cutting through the immediate conversation. Benedict stopped mid-sentence. Serafina raised an eyebrow. Even King Leopold shifted his gaze, his predatory focus snapping onto the insignificant human waitress. Cedric didn't look up. He was staring at his hands, resigned to his invisibility. Isolde took a breath. She didn't speak. To speak to a royal without permission was death. Instead, she moved her hands. She caught Cedric's peripheral vision. "Are you thirsty?" The movements were small, precise, and hidden from the wider room by the bulk of her body, but clear to him. Cedric's head snapped up. The shock on his face was raw, stripping away the mask of indifference he wore. His eyes were a startling shade of violet, the mark of the ancient bloodline, and they widened, locking onto hers. Isolde held his gaze. She repeated the sign, slower this time. Water or wine? For a heartbeat, time suspended. The clatter of the banquet hall seemed to fade into a dull roar. Cedric looked at her not as a servant, but as a revelation. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his right hand. His movements were rusty, stiff from disuse. But the syntax was perfect, an older dialect of the sign language she knew. Water. Please. Isolde felt a smile tug at the corner of her lips. She bowed low, poured the water into his crystal goblet, and placed it within his reach. "Thank you," he signed, his fingers brushing against the tablecloth. "You see me?" "I see you," she signed back. "What is this?" The voice was a low rumble, vibrating through the floorboards. King Leopold had risen. The entire hall fell into a terrified silence. The music stopped. Isolde froze, her hands retreating to her apron. She lowered her head, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had been seen. "The girl," Leopold said, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back of the room. "Step forward." Isolde took one step back from the table and turned to face the king. She curtsied, her knees shaking. "Your Majesty." Leopold loomed over her. He was terrifying up close, a creature of wars and centuries. "You were communicating with the prince. How?" Benedict stood up, sensing blood. "She's likely casting a hex, sire. Look at her. A witch, perhaps. We should remove her hands to be safe." "No." A sound scraped through the air. It wasn't a voice. It was a slam. Cedric had stood up. He slammed his open palm onto the table, shattering the silence. He was glaring at Benedict, his chest heaving. He turned to his father and began to sign, rapidly, aggressively, his movements sharp and fluid. Isolde watched, stunned. He was signing. She offered kindness, something this court knows nothing of. "Do not touch her." Leopold watched his son, his expression unreadable. For years, Cedric had been a ghost in his own hall. Now, he was standing, his eyes blazing with a fire Leopold hadn't seen since the boy's mother died. The king looked from his son to the trembling waitress. "You understand him?" Leopold asked Isolde, his tone quieter, dangerous. "Yes, your Majesty," Isolde whispered. My grandmother. She taught me the silent tongue. Leopold looked at Cedric, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in decades. The court held its collective breath. Serafina looked furious. Benedict looked calculating. "Benedict?" Leopold said, never taking his eyes off Isolde. "Sit down." Benedict flushed, humiliated, and sank back into his chair. "Girl," Leopold commanded, "you are relieved of your duties in the hall." Isolde felt the blood drain from her face. This was it, the execution order. "You are to report to the East Wing," Leopold continued, his voice finalizing the decree. "You will serve the prince, exclusively. If he has a voice, I want to know what he is saying." The East Wing of the Obsidian Palace was a study in isolation. Unlike the opulent, busy corridors of the main keep, this wing was silent, draped in heavy tapestries that muffled sound. It was beautiful, but it was a prison. Isolde stood in the center of the prince's private study 2 hours later. She had been scrubbed clean, dressed in a uniform of finer wool, dark grey with silver stitching, and told to wait. The room was filled with books, stacks of them, towering like unsteady chimneys against the walls. Maps of the kingdom, treatises on history, philosophy, and warfare covered every surface. It was the den of a scholar, not a simpleton. The door creaked open. Cedric entered. He had shed the heavy ceremonial velvet coat, wearing only a white linen shirt and dark trousers. He looked younger here, less guarded, but the wariness in his eyes remained. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't come closer. He stood by the door, watching her as if she were a mirage that might vanish. Isolde raised her hands slowly. "I am Isolde." Cedric let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. He walked to his desk and sat on the edge of it, crossing his arms. "I am Cedric," he signed. "Why did you do it?" "It was foolish." Isolde blinked. "You were thirsty." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "I could have died of thirst, and the court would have applauded my restraint. You risked your life for a glass of water." "I risked it for dignity," she signed back, her movements crisp. "Everyone deserves to be heard." Cedric looked away, staring into the hearth fire. "My father does not want me heard. He wants me strong. And in our world, silence is weakness. They think I am broken because the curse took my voice." Isolde stepped closer, emboldened by the privacy of the room. "The curse." Cedric touched his throat. "An ancient hex. A price paid by my mother to save my life when I was born. It took her life and my voice. My father looks at me and sees only her death and my failure." Isolde felt a pang of sorrow so sharp it stole her breath. This was the monster the city feared. This lonely, burdened young man surrounded by books. "He defended you tonight," Isolde signed. "He was curious," Cedric corrected. "He sees you as a tool, a translator. Be careful, Isolde." Benedict watches everything. He wants the throne. A mute king cannot command the legions, or so the law says. Benedict waits for my father to fall so he can declare me unfit and take the crown. Isolde realized then the perilous web she had stepped into. She wasn't just a servant anymore. She was the key to a political coup. If she could give Cedric a voice, she threatened Benedict's claim to power. "Then we must be careful," she signed. "But I will not leave." Cedric looked at her, his violet eyes searching hers. For the first time, the distance between human and vampire, predator and prey, seemed to vanish. "Why?" he asked. Isolde thought of the poverty in the lower city, the cruelty of the guards, the hopelessness of her people. But she also thought of the way he had looked at the water pitcher. "Because," she signed, her fingers soft in the air. "I know what it is like to scream in a room where no one is listening." Cedric reached out. For a terrifying second, she thought he would strike her. Instead, His cold hand hovered over hers, not touching, but close enough to feel the chill radiating from him. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors burst open. Isolde jumped back, her heart seizing. Benedict stood there, flanked by 2 armed guards. His razor smile was gone, replaced by cold malice. "The king requests the prince's presence in the war room," Benedict said smoothly, though his eyes were fixed on Isolde like a hawk spotting a field mouse. "And he insists the translator accompanies him." Benedict stepped into the room, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "Make no mistake, girl. If you translate one word wrong, if you make him seem competent, accidents happen in the East Wing every day." Cedric stepped in front of Isolde, his body a shield. He stared Benedict down, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Isolde saw the tremble in Cedric's shoulders, not fear, but restraint. The wolf was not the king. The wolf was the rage sleeping inside the silent boy. And she had just woken it up. The war room was a stark contrast to the decadence of the banquet hall. Here, the walls were lined with iron, not velvet, and the air smelled of stale tobacco and ozone. A massive tactical map of the kingdom dominated the center table, illuminated by floating orbs of cold, magical light. Isolde stood slightly behind Cedric's right shoulder. She felt small in the presence of the realm's military elite, 5 vampire generals with scars that predated modern civilization. At the head of the table, King Leopold looked weary, his fingers tracing the borderlands on the map where red markers indicated a rebel encroachment. "The northern pass is compromised," General Draven growled, slamming a gauntleted fist onto the table. "We must send the Iron Legion, burn the villages, flush the rebels out with fire." "And destroy the grain stores for the winter?" Benedict Thornwall countered, leaning against a pillar, looking bored. "Starve the peasantry, and you create more rebels, Draven. I say we send assassins. Cut off the head of the snake." "Too slow," Draven argued. "We need a show of force." The argument descended into a cacophony of snarled insults. Cedric stood motionless, his eyes scanning the map. He wasn't looking at the northern pass. He was looking at the riverlands to the east. He raised a hand. Isolde caught the movement instantly. She stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly before finding its strength. "The prince wishes to speak." The room fell silent. General Draven scoffed. "The boy wishes to play with toy soldiers. This is war, not a nursery." Leopold shot the general a withering look. "Speak, girl." "What does he say?" Isolde watched Cedric's hands. They moved with a fluid, hypnotic speed, confident and sharp. "The prince says," Isolde translated, her eyes flicking between Cedric and the king, "that the northern pass is a distraction. The rebels are not foolish enough to attack the most fortified point of the border in winter." Benedict straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "He says," Isolde continued, struggling to keep up with Cedric's fervent signing, "that the recent raids on the timber mills in the east were not for resources, but to clear a line of sight. Look at the river." Cedric reached out, his pale finger tracing the blue line of the Serpent River. He tapped a specific bend. "The ice is thinnest here," Isolde said, voicing his thoughts. "If they breach the dam at Blackwood, the floodwaters will freeze the valley within hours. The Iron Legion won't be able to march. They will be trapped in ice." The generals looked at the map. Draven paled. "The Blackwood Dam. It supplies water to the capital. If they freeze the valley, they cut off the city," Leopold finished, his voice grave. "It is a siege." Cedric signed again, sharper this time. "Send the Legion to the dam. Quietly. Ambush them before they set the charges." Isolde relayed the command. For a long moment, no one moved. The idea was brilliant, a tactical insight that seasoned generals had missed because they were too focused on brute strength. "And why should we listen to a mute whelp?" Benedict sneered, though he looked rattled. "This is speculation." "It is strategy," Leopold said, his voice ringing with finality. "Draven, mobilize the Legion to Blackwood. Move under the cover of darkness." As the generals scrambled to obey, King Leopold looked at his son. There was no warmth in his gaze, but there was a new weight: respect. "You have your mother's mind, Cedric," Leopold murmured. He didn't say it as a compliment, he said it as if it were a curse. Cedric didn't respond to his father. He turned to Isolde. "Thank you," he signed, a small, private gesture against his chest. Isolde felt a flush rise to her cheeks. In that room of monsters and maps, she and Cedric had built a bridge. He was the mind, and she was the voice. Together, they were formidable. But as they left the war room, Isolde caught Benedict watching them. He wasn't sneering anymore. He was looking at Isolde as if she were a loose thread in a tapestry, one he intended to cut. 2 weeks later, the snow came, a heavy, relentless blanket that turned the palace grounds into a monochrome world of white and grey. To celebrate the victory at Blackwood Dam, for Cedric had been right, and the rebels were crushed, the king ordered a royal hunt. It was a tradition Isolde loathed, the aristocracy riding out to slaughter, terrified game for sport. As Cedric's personal attendant, Isolde was required to accompany him. They rode near the edge of the hunting party. Cedric sat atop a massive black destrier, handling the beast with an easy grace. Isolde rode a smaller mare beside him, wrapped in thick furs Cedric had insisted she wear. The forest was silent, the trees heavy with snow. They had drifted away from the main group, the baying of the hounds fading into the distance. "You are cold," Cedric signed, one hand on the reins. "I'm fine," Isolde lied, her teeth chattering. "I'm just not used to this." She gestured to the oppressive grandeur of the winter woods. "It is cruel beauty," Cedric agreed, "like everything in this court." Suddenly, a crack echoed through the trees, not the snap of a branch, but the distinct, mechanical twang of a heavy crossbow. Cedric moved before the sound even registered in Isolde's mind. He launched himself from his horse, tackling Isolde off her mare. They hit the snow hard, rolling into a drift, just as a black-fletched bolt buried itself in the tree trunk where Isolde's head had been a second ago. "Assassin!" Isolde gasped, scrambling to her knees. Cedric pushed her down, his body covering hers. He looked different. His eyes were no longer violet. They had bled into a luminous, feral gold. A low growl vibrated in his chest, a sound that was distinctly, terrifyingly non-human. Another bolt whizzed past, grazing Cedric's shoulder. He didn't flinch. "Run," he signed, his movements jerky. "To the caves, north." "I'm not leaving you," Isolde cried. Cedric grabbed her shoulders. The human mask was slipping. His teeth looked sharper, his nails lengthening into claws. "Go, I cannot protect you if I am holding back." Isolde realized then what he meant. The wolf inside him. The rumors of the Alpha King. He wasn't just a vampire. He was something older, wilder. She scrambled up and ran, her boots slipping in the deep snow. She made it to the ridge line and threw herself behind a boulder. She looked back. 3 figures in white camouflage had emerged from the trees, swords drawn. They weren't rebels. Their weapons bore the crest of the royal guard. Benedict's men. Cedric stood to meet them. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't need to. With a roar that shook the snow from the branches, Cedric changed. It wasn't the mist shift of a vampire. It was the bone-breaking, fur-sprouting transformation of a lichen. A massive, midnight black wolf stood where the prince had been. The assassins faltered. They had come to kill a mute boy. They had found a monster. The wolf lunged. It was a blur of shadow and teeth. The fight was brutal and short. Within seconds the snow was stained scarlet, and the three assassins lay still. The wolf stood panting, steam rising from its coat. It turned its golden eyes toward the ridge where Isolde hid. Isolde's heart hammered against her ribs. She should have been terrified. She should have run. But she saw the way the wolf favored its left shoulder, where the bolt had grazed the man. Slowly she stood up. The wolf growled low, a warning. "Stay back." "Cedric," she whispered. She stepped out into the open. The wolf flinched, crouching as if expecting a blow. Isolde walked down the slope, her hands open, palms up. "It's me," she said softly. "I see you." The wolf whined. The transformation reversed, a painful shifting of bone and skin, until Cedric lay shivering in the snow, human again, bleeding and naked from the waist up. Isolde didn't look away. She ran to him, unclasping her heavy fur cloak and draping it over him. "You're hurt," she said, her hands hovering over the gash on his shoulder. Cedric looked up at her, his face pale, streaks of blood on his cheek. He looked devastated. "You saw," he signed weakly. "The beast." "I saw the king," Isolde corrected him, her voice fierce. She tore a strip from her petticoat and began to bind his wound. A wolf who protects his own. Cedric grabbed her hand, stopping her. His skin was burning hot now, the fever heat of a shifter healing. "My mother was the last winter queen of the wolves," he explained, his hands shaking. "My father killed her tribe but took her. I am the result. A hybrid, an abomination to both sides." "You are not an abomination," Isolde said, pressing her hand against his cheek. "You are the bridge, Cedric. Don't you see? You are the only one who can unite them." Cedric leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't filled with words needing to be said. It was filled with a magnetic, undeniable pull. "They will kill you for knowing this," he signed. "Let them try," Isolde whispered. Under the canopy of the winter trees, with the scent of blood and pine in the air, Cedric leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. It wasn't a kiss. It was something more intimate. It was an alpha acknowledging his mate. The return to the palace was somber. They claimed the assassins were rebels, and Cedric's wound was from a fall. Benedict accepted the story with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He knew his men hadn't returned. That night, the atmosphere in the palace shifted. The shadows seemed longer, the whispers louder. Isolde was in her quarters, folding Cedric's mended shirts, when the door was kicked open. Benedict Thornwall stood there, not with guards, but with the king. "Search the room," Benedict ordered. Guards tore through Isolde's meager possessions. They ripped open her mattress, overturned her small trunk. "What is the meaning of this?" Isolde demanded, backing against the wall. "Treason, my dear," Benedict purred. He reached into the hollow beneath her floorboards, a loose plank she hadn't even known existed, and pulled out a bundle of letters. He tossed them to the king. Leopold opened one, his face turned to stone. "Maps of the palace defenses," Leopold read, his voice devoid of emotion. "Schedules of the patrol routes. Correspondence with the rebel leaders in the north." "I have never seen those," Isolde cried. "He planted them." "Silence!" Leopold roared. The force of his voice cracked the window pane. "She is a spy, Majesty," Benedict said, looking mournfully at Isolde. "Using her skills to get close to the prince, to extract secrets from our war room. It explains how she knew about the dam. She was coordinating the attack, not preventing it. She likely fed the prince the information to gain his trust." It was a perfect lie. It took Cedric's brilliance and twisted it into Isolde's treachery. "No," Isolde wept. "Cedric knows. Ask him." "The prince is bewitched," Benedict said. "He is simple-minded, easily manipulated by a pretty face and a pair of moving hands." "Arrest her," Leopold commanded, "and burn these letters." 2 guards seized Isolde by the arms. She struggled, screaming for Cedric, but they dragged her out into the corridor. They didn't take her to the dungeons. They took her to the great hall. A crowd had gathered, and there, standing by the throne, held back by 4 guards, was Cedric. When he saw Isolde, bruised and held captive, he thrashed against his captors. He let out a silent scream, his mouth opening, his cords straining, but no sound came out. The curse held fast. "She is innocent," he signed frantically to his father. "It is a lie. Benedict is the traitor." Leopold looked at his son with cold pity. "She has deceived you, boy. She used you." "No," Cedric signed, tears streaming down his face. "She is my heart." Benedict stepped forward. "The penalty for high treason is death at dawn. But perhaps we can be merciful. If she confesses—" He looked at Isolde. "Admit you used the prince. Admit he is nothing but a mute fool you manipulated." Isolde looked at Cedric. He had stopped struggling. He was watching her, begging her with his eyes to save herself, to lie if she had to. But Isolde straightened her spine. She thought of the wolf in the snow. She thought of the man who had poured water for himself just to show he existed. "He is not a fool," Isolde said, her voice ringing clear in the hall. "He is the rightful king. He is strong and kind, and he sees more in his silence than you do with all your spies. I didn't use him. I love him." The confession hung in the air like a blade. Leopold's expression hardened. "Love? Then you shall die for it." "Take her to the tower," Leopold ordered. "Execution at first light." As they dragged her away, Cedric slumped to his knees. The guards released him, thinking him broken. But as the heavy door slammed shut, cutting off his view of Isolde, Cedric didn't weep. He placed his hands on the cold stone floor. The wolf wasn't sleeping anymore, and the vampire was thirsty. The curse blocked his voice, but it said nothing about his howl. Inside his mind, the lock on the ancient laws clicked open. If he couldn't speak to save her, he would have to burn the kingdom down to reach her. The Tower of Silence was not merely a prison. It was a sensory deprivation tank designed to break the spirit before the body. Isolde sat on the floor of her cell, the stone leaching the warmth from her bones until she felt as brittle as dry parchment. The air smelled of wet rust and old despair. Through the single barred slit high above, she watched the sky bleed from bruised purple to the violent crimson of dawn. It was a beautiful day to die. She didn't cry. She had spent her tears in the first hour of her imprisonment. Now, there was only a hollow ache in her chest where her heart used to be. She traced the lines of her palm, remembering the rough texture of Cedric's skin, the desperate weight of his forehead against hers in the snow, and the golden fire in his eyes when he had transformed. "He will come," a treacherous voice whispered in her mind. "He cannot," logic answered. "He is bound by silver and silence." The heavy iron door groaned open, the sound screeching like a wounded animal. "Time," the executioner grunted. He was a gargoyle of a man, a low-born vampire whose skin had grayed with age and cruelty, his face hidden behind a executioner's leather hood that smelled of cured meat. Isolde stood up. Her legs trembled, betraying her terror, but she locked her knees and lifted her chin. She thought of her grandmother, Genevieve, who had survived the purges of the old wars. She would not walk to her death cowering. She walked out of the cell, flanked by 4 guards in ceremonial armor. They led her down the spiraling stairs, the air growing warmer and thicker with the scent of perfume and anticipation as they descended toward the courtyard. The execution was to be public, a spectacle. a warning to any human who dared to dream of rising above their station, and a reminder to the court of who held the leash. The courtyard was packed. The vampire aristocracy stood on the tiered balconies, sipping morning tonic laced with blood, their faces masks of bored anticipation. They fanned themselves with ivory fans, whispering gossip, treating a woman's death like a matinee theatre performance. Benedict Thornwall stood on the raised dais next to the king, looking every inch the victor. He wore a coat of crushed velvet the colour of dried blood, and his smile was a sharp, white wound in his face. King Leopold stood beside him, looking old and diminished, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, refusing to look at the girl he had condemned. Isolde was led to the block. The wood was stained dark, almost black, with centuries of judgment. The smell of iron was overwhelming here. She was forced to her knees, the rough grain of the wood biting into her skin. "Any final words?" Benedict asked, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the yard. "Perhaps a confession to save your soul? Admit your treachery, girl, and we may make it quick." Isolde looked up at him, her eyes burning. She scanned the crowd one last time, searching for a face she knew wouldn't be there. She hoped Cedric was asleep. She hoped he was dreaming of the north, running free in the snow, unaware of the axe hovering over her neck. "My silence," Isolde said, her voice not shouting, but carrying clear and steady across the hushed yard, "will speak louder than your lies. You may kill the speaker, Benedict, but you cannot kill the truth." Benedict's smile faltered for a second, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before it hardened into malice. He nodded to the executioner. The axe was raised. The sun crested the horizon, blindingly bright, painting the blade in fire. Isolde closed her eyes and took a breath, holding the image of the white wolf in her mind. And then the world shattered. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical force, a concussion of air that knocked the breath from the spectators' lungs. The massive iron gates of the courtyard, gates that had withstood siege engines in the Great War, exploded inward. They didn't just open, they were twisted off their hinges as if they were made of tin, flying into the courtyard with a screech of tearing metal. Wood splinters and iron shrapnel rained down. The crowd screamed, the bored aristocracy suddenly scrambling in terror, spilling their tonic. Through the dust and debris, a shape emerged from the settling cloud. It was a wolf, but not just a wolf. It was a nightmare of fur and muscle, standing nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder, its coat as black as the void between stars, absorbing the morning light. Its eyes burned with a golden, celestial fire that seemed to scorch the air. And behind him came the pack. Dozens of grey and white wolves, the remnants of the winter tribe, summoned by the psychic call of their true alpha. They poured into the courtyard like a flood of living winter. "Treason!" Benedict screamed, his voice cracking. He drew his sword, the metal singing. "Kill the beast! Put it down!" The royal guard rushed forward, their armor clanking, spears lowered. The black wolf didn't slow down. He roared, a sound that wasn't just heard, but felt, vibrating in the marrow of every bone in the courtyard. It was the sound of a king reclaiming his throne. Cedric hit the line of guards like a battering ram. He didn't tear them apart, he swatted them aside with calculated crushing force, sending armored bodies flying like dolls. He was carving a path straight to the dais. The executioner raised his axe, panic seizing him, aiming not at Isolde, but at the approaching monster. "Cedric!" Isolde screamed. She threw herself sideways, rolling off the block just as the black wolf leaped. He cleared 20 feet in a single bound, an arc of shadow against the sun. He landed on the dais with a tremor that cracked the stone foundation. He stood over Isolde, snarling, his fangs bared, saliva dripping onto the stone. He was terrifying, a primal god of vengeance, daring the world to come one step closer to his mate. Leopold stood frozen, staring at the creature. His hand went to his chest. "The Winter King," he whispered, a ghost of old fear in his eyes. The legends were true. Benedict, realizing his plans were unraveling, grabbed a spear from a fallen guard. His face was twisted in a rictus of hate. "He is a monster, a rabid beast. I will put him down myself and save the kingdom." He lunged, the spear tip glowing with a green, necrotic poison. Cedric didn't dodge. He shifted. It was a violent, impossible motion. Mid-lunge, the fur receded. The bones snapped and reformed. The snout retracted. In the blink of an eye, the wolf was gone, and Cedric stood there in human form. He was naked, magnificent, and bleeding from a dozen small cuts. But he caught the spear shaft in one hand, just inches from his bare chest. The courtyard fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. Cedric snapped the spear in half with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. He looked at Benedict, then at his father, and finally he turned his gaze to the crowd. He raised his hands, blood running down his forearms. "The king is blind," he signed, his movement sweeping and grand, visible to everyone. But the wolf sees. Isolde scrambled to her feet, her voice finding the rhythm of his hands, becoming the voice he was denied. "The king is blind, but the wolf sees!" she screamed, translating for the court, her voice breaking with emotion. Cedric pointed a bloodied finger at Benedict. "You poisoned the king's mind. You forged the letters. You sent the assassins to the winter woods." "Lies!" Benedict shrieked, backing away. "He is mad! The curse has rotted his brain!" Cedric reached into the waistband of his torn trousers, shreds of fabric that had survived the shift, and pulled out a small, crumpled object. It was a signet ring, heavy gold bearing the crest of the thorn. Benedict's signet ring. He threw it at his father's feet. It rang against the stone. "I took this from the assassin in the woods," Cedric signed, his face a mask of cold judgment. "He wore your crest. He died with your name on his lips." Leopold looked down at the ring. He looked at Benedict. The betrayal was absolute, a knife in the back he had never seen coming. "Seize him," Leopold said, his voice low and deadly, the command of a vampire elder returning. Benedict snarled, realizing the game was up. He didn't run. He pulled a vial from his coat, volatile, alchemical fire, unstable and devastating, and threw it. Not at Cedric, but at Isolde. Time seemed to slow. The glass vial spun through the air, the liquid inside glowing a volatile, angry orange. Isolde watched it come, realizing with a detached horror that she couldn't move fast enough. Cedric saw it too. He saw the fire that would consume the woman who had taught him he was human. He didn't sign. He didn't shift. The distance was too great, the time too short. He did the one thing the curse had forbidden him to do for 20 years. The one thing that was supposed to kill him if he dared attempt it. He gathered every ounce of his soul, every drop of alpha power, and he pushed it into his throat. He screamed. "No!" The sound was raw, jagged, tearing through his throat like broken glass. It was not a human shout. It was a physical shockwave, a sonic boom born of magic and desperation. The sheer force of his will, the Alpha's absolute command, slammed into the air itself. The shockwave hit the vial in mid-air, 3 feet from Isolde's face. The glass shattered instantly. The blast of sound reversed the momentum of the explosion, blowing the fiery liquid backward in a cone of flame. Benedict screamed as the fire he had meant for Isolde splashed over him. He fell back, engulfed in chemical flames that burned green and orange, tumbling off the high dais into the chaos of the courtyard below. Silence descended once more. Absolute, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of distant flames. Cedric fell to his knees, clutching his throat, coughing blood onto the white stone. The curse was broken, shattered not by a spell or a potion, but by the only force stronger than ancient magic, the instinct to protect a mate. Isolde dropped beside him, her hands frantically checking him, not caring about the blood or the nudity. She ripped the hem of her dress to wipe his mouth. "Cedric, you spoke! You spoke!" He looked up at her, his eyes streaming with tears of pain. But he was smiling. A bloody, beautiful smile. King Leopold walked slowly toward them. He looked old, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. He looked at the smoking ruin where his advisor had fallen, then at his son. The son he had hidden, shamed, and ignored for a lifetime. "You broke the silence," Leopold whispered, his voice trembling. The prophecy. It said the silence would end only when the crown found its true voice. He looked at Isolde, then back to Cedric. "I thought the voice meant authority," Leopold said, a single tear of blood tracking down his pale cheek. "I thought it meant the power to command legions, but it meant compassion. It meant love." Leopold reached up and took the heavy obsidian crown from his head. It was a crown of wars, of conquests, of old blood. He looked at it for a moment, seeing it for the burden it was, then knelt. He placed the crown on the stone floor in front of Cedric. "I am not fit to lead," Leopold said, his voice breaking. "I ruled with fear, and fear blinded me to treachery in my own house. You, my son, you ruled with nothing but your hands and your heart, and you commanded the wolves without saying a word." Cedric looked up. His throat was raw, his voice gone again, perhaps temporarily, perhaps not. But he didn't need it. He had never needed it to be strong. He stood up, pulling Isolde with him. He didn't pick up the crown immediately. Instead, he turned to the crowd. Vampires, servants, guards, and the wolves who were now sitting peacefully at the edge of the square, tongues lolling, waiting for orders. He raised his hands. "I will not rule as my father did," he signed. Isolde's voice rang out, strong and clear, interpreting the decree. "I will not rule as my father did." "I will not be a king of silence," Cedric continued, his gestures emphatic. "I will be a king who listens. I will be a king who listens." The crowd bowed, not the stiff, fearful bows of the banquet hall, but deep, reverent bows. They bowed to the hybrid, the outcast, the boy they had mocked. They bowed to the power that had shattered the gates. Isolde squeezed his hand, anchoring him. Cedric looked at her, his golden eyes softening to their natural violet. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles, unashamed of his affection before the court. "And she," Cedric signed, looking at the court with a fierce pride, "is my queen. Her voice is my voice." Leopold bowed his head lower than anyone. The guards lowered their weapons, and in the distance, from the snow-covered peaks, a chorus of howls answered, echoing off the palace walls, welcoming the new age. Spring came late to the obsidian palace, but when it arrived, it was riotous. The snow melted into rushing rivers that scoured the valleys clean, and the world turned a shocking, vibrant green. The palace itself had changed. The heavy velvet curtains that had blocked the sun for centuries were pulled back, letting light flood the dark corridors. The smell of stale blood and old wax was gone, replaced by the scent of pine, fresh bread, and rain. The war room was no longer a place of smoke and secrets. It was a council chamber where humans, vampires, and representatives of the wolf tribes sat at the same table. The map in the center was no longer used for conquest, but for trade routes and irrigation. Cedric sat on the throne. It was not the jagged obsidian chair of his father, which had been moved to the archives. It was a new seat, carved from white oak and inlaid with silver, a fusion of vampire elegance and wolf strength. He wore the crown lightly, often taking it off to work. His voice had returned, though it was permanently altered. It was a raspy, gravelly baritone that sounded like stone.